What are some events in recorded history that are extremely hard to believe? Before we start with the first story, please hit subscribe and ring the notification bell to stay updated with us. Story 1. When Abraham Lincoln was still a state legislator in Illinois, he got into a public feud with a rival politician named James Shields that culminated in Shields challenging Lincoln to a duel. As the challenge party, Lincoln was given the choice of weapons for the duel. Shields assumed he would choose pistols. Lincoln chose broadswords. When they arrived at the duel site and were getting ready, Lincoln demonstrated his significant height and reach advantage over Shields by swinging his sword over his head and cutting a tree branch clean off. Shields then realized he'd made a huge mistake and immediately conceded. Story 2. The story of Desmond Doss. If you've seen Hacksaw Ridge, that tells it, but they tell the watered-down version for the movie because they didn't think anyone would believe it with all the full details. The basics of the story are basically he was left behind on a cliff with a lot of men who were wounded when the US had to pull out in World War II. He then single-handedly carried 75 men off that cliff and lowered them down to men below to be rescued. He was the first conscientious objector to win the Medal of Honor for what he did, but he was also malnourished. Because of his religious beliefs, he couldn't eat some of the food he was given, so he's this very thin guy, managing to lift and carry 75 men in one night and then lower them down a cliff. And the movie showed the next day he knocked away a grenade and was injured, but he was more injured than they showed with 17 pieces of shrapnel in his body. And he literally got off the stretcher when waiting to be brought down for someone more injured than he was, and was providing medical care to that guy as he had been blasted. Story 3. I was on a surgery rotation when I watched this movie. It is the third day and we were in office. No patients in the afternoon, so the surgeon asked if I'd watch a movie with him. I said sure. Hacksaw Ridge. The man started sobbing, shoulders heaving, sobbing. I pat him on the back, not really sure what to do here, as my 3 days of interactions with him had been full of him being a condescending, arrogant, insulting. I messaged the student who was with him prior. I just go, Hacksaw Ridge. She responded, did he break down? So it seems every 6 weeks this man watches Hacksaw Ridge and just sobs. I hated that guy. Good movie though. Story 4. The raising of Chicago sounds completely made up. In the 1850s, Chicago kept flooding, so they went around block by block and lifted the entire city by approximately 6 to 14 feet using nothing but human-powered jack screws. Streets were filled in and raised to meet the new elevation. A handful of buildings didn't get raised and now have the ground floor on what was once the second floor. Pullman, the railcar company, got their start in this industry and only shifted to railcar manufacturing once they ran out of buildings to raise. Everyone talks about the 1800s engineering insanity of reversing the river so that it flowed into the Mississippi instead of Lake Michigan. But the raising is rarely mentioned, I think, because it's so unbelievable. Story 5. There's an entire list of unusual deaths on the wiki. One that stands out to me happened on 24th October 1988. A boy was playing with his pet poodle Kashi in Caballito, Buenos Aires. They lived in a 13-story apartment, and sadly the dog slipped under their balcony railing and fell to its death. Kashi hit a 75-year-old woman, killing her instantly. A large crowd gathered to look on at the tragedy, and in an attempt to join said crowd, another woman accidentally walked in front of a bus, killing her instantly. Seeing this sudden, violent death caused an old man nearby to die from shock. Grim Reaper was doing hat-trick plays that day. Story 6. These events are recorded in the physical record of the universe, so I think they count. There is new evidence that sharks may be older than the rings of Saturn. New etimates of their formation overlap with some of the earliest fossil records of sharks. The Appalachian Mountains were already old and eroding when the rings of Saturn were formed. When animals first stepped into land from the ocean, they were ancient and crumbling. They and the Scottish Highlands are part of the same mountain chain, since they have existed since before the continents separated from Pangaea to go their own ways. Story 7. That our knowledge of the civilizations north of Rome are mostly defined by Caesar himself and a political diatribe to reinforce his standing. The entire world of massive civilizations are a giant question mark. The areas around the Fertile Crescent became dry and parched and inhabitable, preserving the clay tablets and so forth. The areas north of Rome warmed into the greatest forest in human history, inhabited by myriad different civilizations that are truly just lost to time. The areas around recorded history are what fascinates me. Thank God for plenty. Story 8. The fact that after the entire world made hullabaloo of Holocaust pretending like they have learned the lesson and a genocide will never occur again. The fact that genocide is being live streamed and yet it's an acceptable thing. Close to 1 million people in Armenia were displaced, and yet it barely made any news because the powerful countries decided it's okay. The fact that despite having a level of wealth, resources, technology, and prosperity which has never been seen, we've people struggling with hunger. Not in recorded history, but it'll be in history, 20 years later. Story 9. In 2012, Felix Baumgartner skydived from a weather balloon at roughly 24 miles above the Earth's surface. He was so high up that he needed a spacesuit and SCBA. During freefall, he accelerated to over 800 miles per hour, breaking the sound barrier, and fell for nearly 4.5 minutes. He broke the previous record, which stood for half a century, by more than 25,000 feet. It's never been confirmed, but I think he was unconscious for part of the fall. Ground control lost communication with him at around the same time that he lost control of his flight symmetry. Story 10. In 1960, the UN Secretary General was en route to peace talks in southern Africa after the coup in the Congo. He appears to have been murdered by a collection of Western governments, including the US, the UK, and Belgium, who stood to profit if the Congo did not nationalize its copper mines. As an aside, at the same time, a UN peacekeeping force of Irish soldiers was sent to a small village called Jodorville, modern-day Likasi. Irish soldiers held out against a force of between and Belgian French and local mercenaries. From the 13th to the 17th of September, they held out in a location with absolutely no defensive structures. They couldn't dig themselves, and without any resupply or relief. Although they were finally forced to surrender, not one of them was killed. Story 11. It's Sarajevo, 1914. After failing to assassinate Archduke Francis Ferdinand with a bomb, Gavrilo Princip and his 5 young anarchist friends blew up another car by accident. Ferdinand continued on and gave a speech that afternoon. Princip went to eat at a deli, presumably depressed. Later, Ferdinand left the speech and decided to visit the victims of the earlier bombing in the hospital. His driver coincidentally decided to come down the street by the deli, but Ferdinand told his driver, a Czech, that he'd taken a wrong turn. They were supposed to take a route that stayed by the harbor, so the driver stopped in front of the deli and began turning the car around. At the deli, Princip looked up from his coffee. Archduke Francis Ferdinand was literally right in front of him. Princip stood up, walked over to the car while it was turning around, and shot Ferdinand and his wife with a pistol through the back seat window. He killed both of them. Princip was wrestled to the ground by onlookers. He tried to eat a cyanide capsule, but it didn't work, and he survived. He was 19 years old and was too young to be sentenced to death, so he went to prison instead. He died of malnutrition 3 years later. The result: a single wrong turn by a Czech driver caused the event that started World War I and led to the deaths of 40 million people. Story 12. I'm sure someone here will correct me where I'm wrong, but the general details of the Love Canal disaster in Western New York, as I understand them barely, are almost impossible to believe. School district buys a chemical dump from a chemical company for $1, with the explicit understanding that the land has been rendered inhospitable by poisonous chemicals, and under the condition that the chemical company can't be held liable for any resulting damages if the land is used for human habitation. School district tries to build elementary school on top of chemical dump, but the contractors have trouble pouring a foundation because of all the chemicals in the ground. School district instructs contractors to move the foundation of the school by a few feet in order to put the playground on top of the chemicals, thereby making space available for the school's foundation. The school opens, and surprise, everyone gets cancer and babies in the neighborhood are born with deformities. The municipal government and the school district gaslight the citizenry for as long as they can, but eventually the truth makes its way to Albany, and up the chain from there. The chemical company says, "As you're aware, we put some really nasty chemicals in the ground we sold you. That's why we told you not to build anything there." Like in elementary school, for example, you agreed to this and our immunity as a condition of the sale. Story 13. The story of Avelo the cabbage. Dude was a Bulgarian farmer in the 1200s. Got tired of the Mongols raiding the land and his nobles not doing anything, so he put together a peasant revolt and killed the Tsar. The Byzantine emperor kept trying to put him down and he beat them back. There was some complicated f***ery involving inheritances and marriage. But long story short, Ivaylo married the widowed empress and was recognized as the Emperor of Bulgaria as a result. He kept fighting back the Byzantine Empire, but finally he ended up blockaded by the Mongols. Out of action for 3 months, rumors of his death spread, and the Bulgarian capital surrendered to the Byzantines. They then exiled Ivailo. He failed to retake the capital and decided to move in with the Mongols in an attempt to regain his power. He was then murdered by Nogai Khan because the Mongols preferred the Byzantines since Nogai was married to one of their daughters. All of these events occurred over the course of about 3 years. Story 14. The papal election of 1159 was absolute madness. Out of a total of 30 cardinals, 27 voted for Roland of Siena and the remaining 3 supported Cardinal Octavian, who had known sympathies with the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. As Roland of Siena, hereafter known as Pope Alexander III, was being presented with the papal mantle, Octavian, hereafter known as Pope Victor IV, went into a rage and snatched the papal mantle off Alexander's back. One of the people present snatched the mantle from him. One of Victor IV's chaplains snatched it back. Then Victor IV put it on and demanded to be crowned pope. The crowd then proceeded to break into hysterical laughter because he put it on backwards. It was at this point that a band of armed men burst into the Church of St. Peter and chased everyone out. Then Victor's supporters declared him to be the new pope. Alexander fled to the Basilica of St. Peter, and his people declared him the new pope. Both of them excommunicated each other, and they both declared each other antipopes. To make things more complicated, then Victor IV died, and his successor, Pope Paschal III, kept up the fight and was also declared an antipope. All this nonsense continued until Barbarossa was defeated at the Battle of Legnano and Alexander III was officially declared pope. Story 15. The tale of Mike, the durable Malloy. He was also nicknamed the Irish Rasputin for reasons that will soon become clear. An out-of-work firefighter turned alcoholic during the Great Depression becomes a regular at a speakeasy owned by a shady bunch of crooks. They figure nobody would miss him much if he died, so they hatch a plan. Get him to drunkenly take out a life insurance policy in their name and let him drink himself to death. So they give him an unlimited bar tab and the strongest stuff they've got in stock. Despite drinking all day, he's handling it just fine. So they start putting antifreeze and pure methanol in his drinks, trying to poison him. It still doesn't kill him, so they throw in rat poison, horse liniment, turpentine, anything they can think of that'd send you straight to hospital if you ingested it. Does that bother old Iron Mike? No, sir. He just comes back the next day and orders more drinks. So they give him food too, raw oysters soaked in whiskey, and sandwiches laced with rat poison and carpet tacks. Not only does Mike Malloy scoff a lot, but he leaves that night and comes back the next morning complaining he had nothing more than a bit of an upset stomach. By this point, the gang are getting desperate. Clearly nothing they feed him is going to do any damage, no matter how poisonous. So they get him blackout drunk, strip him naked, and leave him in the middle of the park soaked in water. And being the middle of winter, dying of hypothermia seemed like a sure thing. Does he die? Does he ever? He turns up happily the next morning and orders more drinks, none the wiser. By now, the gang don't care how they do it. They just want to kill this impervious bastard however they can. After he leaves for the night, one of them runs him over in their car, breaking his bones and sending him to the hospital. 3 weeks later, Mike Malloy leaves the hospital, still alive. The gang still haven't got their hands on any money. Finally, after Malloy passed out drunk in their bar yet again, they take him to an apartment, hook a hose up to the gas main, and stick it in his mouth. After all that effort, carbon monoxide poisoning is what finally does Mike Malloy in. Of course, by this point, the legend of Michael Malloy has spread around town, and once the police hear that he's died, they dig him up to examine the body. The Murder Trust, as the press end up naming them, are quickly rounded up. They get nothing except a short trip to the electric chair. Alas, Mike was indeed killed in the end, but if he rose from his grave and wandered into a nearby bar to order a few rounds, it wouldn't surprise me all that much. Alright folks, that's a wrap. If you like this, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. You can also share your those in the comment below.